Words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be always acceptable to you, O God, our strength and our salvation. Amen. One of the hard things about the lectionary is that when we hear the scriptures in such small chunks, we can sometimes forget where we are in the broader story. I think this is especially true for today's gospel passage, which is often referred to as the cleansing of the temple, and which takes place during the last week of Jesus's life after his entrance into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. I like how peace activist John Deere summarizes the context of this iconic passage that occurs in all four gospels, which is rare. He says, "It is clear from the basic plot line in Mark, Matthew, and Luke that Jesus organizes the poor and disenfranchised in Galilee, and then heads toward Jerusalem on a walking campaign of nonviolence. He enters the city riding on a donkey in a peace march, cases the temple, and the next day engages in peaceful civil disobedience by turning over tables of the money changers and preventing people from coming and going. After denouncing this den of robbers, Jesus teaches the good news of love, compassion, and justice." Now, the action proceeds a bit differently in the Gospel of John, which is the version we heard read by Deacon Karen today. Nevertheless, I'll engage with this passage today in light of the broad consensus of the three synoptic Gospels, and you'll see why later. John, as is so often the case, is something of an outlier. Well, in addition to getting clear on the timeline of events, we also need to get a better understanding of the setting, which you see behind me in reconstruction. For most of us, the reality of the Jerusalem temple is really hard to imagine. The closest thing we have in our society, I suppose, are cathedrals. But even when they include gift shops, modern cathedrals don't encompass nearly the range of functions that the Jerusalem temple did. Again, John Deere's writing helps us to contextualize the setting for one of Jesus's most notorious actions. Deere explains, "The Jerusalem temple was held up as the one and only place where God dwelt. We have nothing quite like it today. It combined worship, commerce, local government, and imperial control. The faithful were told to pay God a visit each year. And so every Passover, they made the long trek to Jerusalem and paid a hefty fee to enter God's sanctuary. The population of Jerusalem tripled during the Passover season. So in effect, the temple held a national bank. It offered loans, kept track of debts, and changed money for a fee. Pilgrims couldn't pay their temple entrance fee or purchase sacrificial animals using local currencies from their hometowns. Instead, they had to exchange their money for the temple currency. And of course, the money changers charged fees for this service. And of course, these fees would have especially harmed the poor. So as you might guess, it was the extortion of the poor, more than anything else, that liberation theologians tell us motivated Jesus's iconic actions in the temple that day. Jesus's protest action had the effect of temporarily shutting down the financial system of Jerusalem during the annual peak of its commercial activity, and would surely have created major disruption that would not have been looked on kindly by authorities. It's clear then what Jesus was acting against the greed of the empire, against a religious establishment in cahoots with the empire, and against the exploitation of the poor. He also, though, seems to be levying a critique against the entire temple system in and of itself, which makes sense to us who are so far removed from Jesus's social context and for whom there is no parallel to the temple. Yet the way that liberation theology tends to read this text, which has influenced how I tend to read this text, seems to have forgotten something important. It fails to acknowledge that the temple and its sacrificial system, no matter how difficult it is for us to understand them, were not an optional accessory to Judaism, but rather part and parcel of what it meant to be a Jew in Jesus's time and place. And again, we learn that Jesus was a faithful Jew. And it's certainly hard to imagine a faithful Jew completely rejecting something so essential to ancient Jewish faith and practice. To this end, one scholar suggests to attack the money changers was tantamount to attacking the essential atoning function of the temple itself. Only someone who rejected the Torah's explicit teaching concerning the daily offering could have overturned the tables. Such a person would have been seen not as offering a trenchant critique of Jewish religious life, but as madly assaulting one of its indispensable foundations. And according to this scholar, and this is new to me, such an act would have been virtually incomprehensible to other Jews of Jesus's time and place. It wouldn't have been radical so much as unthinkable. Observations like these have led some Bible scholars to cast doubt on the likely historicity of the temple event itself. One scholar argues, for instance, that it's difficult to believe that so heavily a guarded place as the temple could have been assaulted as Jesus did with no response. It really is impossible not to envision the Romans reacting immediately and violently to what would, in effect, be a virtual revolt and occupation of the most strategic area of Jerusalem. And it's even more difficult to imagine that no other ancient writers would have mentioned such an attack on the temple. But nothing appears in the writings of Josephus or other ancient Jewish historians. So where does all of this scholarly deliberation get us? And why would one of the gospel writers, likely Mark, who was the earliest and on whose writing the other synoptic gospels are based, have engaged in such literary license by adding an invented episode to his narrative? We must remember first and foremost that Mark wrote his gospel, as did all of the other gospel writers, after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in the year 70, nearly 40 years after Jesus' death. Jewish rebel forces had occupied Jerusalem seeking independence, and Rome mounted a siege on the city, seeking to restore its power. The temple was destroyed by a small fire that grew out of control. The loss of the temple was, of course, cataclysmic for the Jewish people and for the practice of the Jewish religion. When Mark was writing, the temple was likely already gone, and the Jewish people had entered a period of mourning over its loss. The Talmud speaks of those Jews who, in the aftermath of the temple's destruction, would neither eat meat nor drink wine, who rejected any possibility of normal life and chose not to marry or have children, and who devoted themselves solely to the cause of seeing that the temple was rebuilt. It's difficult to fully express the devastation that the Jewish people felt about the loss of the temple. In the ensuing years, with no temple left to anchor them to Jerusalem and little prospect of building another, the Jewish diaspora began in earnest. Some chose to leave. Others were forced to leave, deported after various Jewish uprisings. And so in this context of pain and loss, what would Mark have been intending by weaving an imagined temple incident into the story of Jesus's final week? Well, I think it's safe to say that portraying Jesus as opposed to vital aspects of temple practice has surely contributed to the painful, fraught relationship between Christianity and Judaism that has been so pervasive until quite recent times. There's so much more to say on this, so much more to think about, and I'm still processing my own reactions to this new information, these new ideas that I have read this week and tried to digest in my heart. But as we continue on our journey through Lent, let us stay awake to the ways that the narrative of Jesus's final days has been used to oppress others rather than to liberate them. How it has been used to blame and demonize and harm. And let us become aware of all the ways that we tend toward blame and demonization and harm. I pray that our gospel will always be a gospel of liberation, even when it is hard work, even when it means we have more questions than answers, even when it requires us to look anew and with a more critical eye at stories we have long held to be both simple and sacred. May it be so. Amen.